All right.
No, no. Look, his kid is just sitting there.
He is.
Oh, sorry. I was talking about my baby because she was hitting the computer screen.
Great.
He must have unmuted it. Sorry.
I love it.
I'm like he's just sitting there and she's like whacking the whole computer.
Just
Well, I've been working from home, so we've got this nice little kind of method where if he wants me, we just let him have me, and then he gets bored, and then we're done. Otherwise,
Oh,
like, no, no, get away. Like, daddy has to work. Daddy has to work. That never
yeah.
works. So once we give him what he wants, then it's fine.
Oh, that's a good idea.
uh, hi Anna, and this this week, by the way, at the end of this week is that I guess the big paper I've been asking people to work on, the skills analysis paper that's incorporating some of the work you've done on assessments, etc. If you need a little more time for that, I'm okay with that because I would prefer people to get this paper right and not rush through it. Um, this is the kind of paper you might want to pick up in 3 or 4 years and read a few times. Um, Let me get. Anyone have any questions before we get started? Um, Tonight's topic is on power and influence, and the book chapter is pretty good, but I wanted to highlight a couple things from it, but I also wanted to highlight just a couple other things that I think are pretty important. And this is one of those topics that this notion of power and influencing other people has a lot to do with leadership, and but the use of power or the misuse of power gets us in more trouble than anything else. You need power to get things done. You need power and the ability to influence, but that gaining that power can also backfire on us. And all of us have a need. And this topic of power is also, related to uh, the ability to control our lives and have control over things. If I confronted you with, say, a scenario from your organization, and you had two people, both with excellent ideas, both have the same idea. One person is pretty well connected throughout the organization, spends a lot of time with people. People got to know the person. The other person is more, works pretty autonomously at their desk, etc. And both ideas have excellent merit. Um, and if I asked you the question, whose idea do you think is going to be advanced? Who has the best chance of having their idea advanced? It probably is the person that is the most connected. And sometimes we call what that person does as playing politics. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit about being a successful politician in your organizations. I'm going to talk about good politics a little bit. But power, and when you talk about politics, you're talking about power. So there's a lot to unpack when we use the word power. A little quote there: the difference between someone who can get an idea off the ground and accepted in an organization and someone who can't isn't a question of who has the better idea. It generally is a question of who has the political competence. And political competence, or the ability to influence or get things done, is a skill you can learn. The use of power is I think, one of the most critical elements of management. And each of us and all of you have to come to terms with power in your lives and how important power. Power is one of the needs, one of our innate needs that we have as humans. Probably the other two we talk about a lot are achievement and affiliation. You know, the need to be with others, the need to accomplish things, and then the need to influence others. Effective leaders tend to make others feel powerful. And people are highly influential when they use their power to help others accomplish things. It generally is difficult to do the truly unusual or the fantastic without some kind of political clout. There's a lot of negativity associated with power. If I said to Jake, "Hey, Jake, I think you have a real high need for power," you might not take that as a compliment. But if I said, "Hey, yeah, you really are a real achievement-oriented person," you might take that as a compliment. So there's a lot of negativity associated with power.
For the record, I'm fine with both.
You're okay with both? Great. In our country, in our American culture, we tend to even be a little more negative in our views of power. And I think a lot of it has to do with our whole notion of a democracy and senses of equality and all that. And you know, having power can be viewed as a form of efficacy.
Now let me cry.
And
Is that what you guys?
people with power, people with power have the ability to shape their environment, whereas the powerless tend to be molded by theirs. So, you know, the question is, how do you gain power? How can you use power? Power is very important to have. I've seen this happen in organizations. People with power or powerful managers, they can intercede on behalf of others. They can help subordinates, people that work for them, get desired placements. Many of them get approvals for budgets beyond what they normally were going to get. They can get items on and off agendas. They get access to decision makers and organizations. They are typically known by people throughout the organization. They're in the information flow. So the relationship between your power or your ability to influence and your personal efficacy is strong. But both the lack of power and abuse of power are equally debilitating and counterproductive. So power is critical, but abuse of it or lack of it can be debilitating. So how can you use personal power to achieve high levels of effectiveness? And, you know, this is a management leadership skill that, you know, we all have to come to terms with. I like this graph from the book. It kind of, you know, having power, you know, is a fine line sometimes between abusing it. You know, the gaining of power in the process of how we gain power sometimes leads to abuse. So there's kind of that fine line of when we're sufficiently using our power, there's a time when somewhere in the middle there between abuse and lack of it is when we're at our most effective. You know, I think of power as the potential to influence behavior. A lot of times we used to think of power in terms of having authority, or we thought of power as the ability to coerce others or get them to do things that I want over what they want. I kind of like a definition of being able to get things done or being able to influence. The word influence I use quite a bit interchangeably with the word leadership. So when I think of the word leadership, I'm thinking of other people, and I'm also thinking of the ability to influence. So the implication of all of this is it's important to come to terms with power. So you having a need for power or desire for power is not necessarily a negative, but it's something that you have to kind of be honest with yourself about how much do I like influencing others? And there's certain career paths we may choose. And if you're in a career where you like to influence others, that's the power need coming out in sales, or even what I'm doing, teaching, being a manager. There's things to that you have that desire to influence others or influence what's going on. So, kind of a couple of the skills related to this topic are, what are some ways you can gain power? And then how can you turn that power into influencing people without resorting to abuse of it? So as I talk the rest of the evening, think about these two things. How do you get power? And then how do you use it in a way that's not abusive? So what are some different strategies that are out there? The book talks about some of these. I'm highlighting some things maybe a little differently than the book does, but one of the biggest ways that we've influenced others is the law of reciprocity. And sometimes as you talk about these things, there's a fine line between ethical, unethical, lawful, unlawful. It's almost a universal belief that people feel we should be paid back for what we do. In almost every organizational transaction, it's really a transactional view of things. I do something for you, I expect something in return. And a lot of times that transactional exchange can be goods or service or even intangible types of things. But, we sometimes think of the two words transactional, sometimes tied in with transformational forms of leadership. Usually transformation begin with some kind of a transaction. All of you are employed, and as a condition of that employment, you expect a paycheck, and there's transactions that take place. There's reciprocity. You expect to receive compensation for what you're doing for an employer, and they expect you to do the job described in your contract. So that's basic reciprocity, and it does underline a lot of things. So that's a basis of it, one basis of influence. When we talk about motivation next week or 2 weeks, we'll talk a little bit about how do you transform that transactional relationship into a really high level performance. So in an organization setting, a lot of these transactions are mutually satisfactory. And if you're offering something that I value, I'm going to like, the reciprocity trade is going to work. And if you put this frame on what happens in your organizations, you see a lot of different currencies at use that are traded. So reciprocity is we're kind of trading back and forth all the time. And a lot of times we're doing it unconsciously. But that basic reciprocity is all kind of always there. People who are perceived by their peers as generous have high social status. People's generosity increases their productivity up to a point. Sometimes too much generosity hinders productivity. So a lot of times, if you're granting favors, doing things for people, and again, I'm talking about tangible and intangible, it's a way to build your status, a way to build your power. I'll talk a little more in depth about some of those. In Change Masters, the author Cantor reported that successful influencers never lose sight of the ultimate goal, but are willing to be flexible about means. So don't confuse means with ends. So when we talk about this reciprocity, we're talking about a way to get to an end. We're trying to influence things in a certain way. So other ways that we may influence beside reciprocity are one is forcing people to do certain things. And that's usually associated with people in positions of power. And they try and force people to do what they want through intimidation or coercion or threatening. That's one form of influence. We've been talking about reciprocity a little bit in here. Like if I do a favor for you, it's kind of, there's like a little ledger there. Okay, I did you a favor, now it's your turn to do me a favor. You know, a lot of people who look at life like that. And then another way we influence people is through rationality. I try to appeal to maybe your personal values, or I may present rational facts to you, try and convince you of the merits and need of something. I want you to go along with the decision I'm making. So these are three basic ways we try and influence others. The intimidation and coercion, a lot of times it's quick and direct, and you may have to use that, but one of the problems is it tends to stifle commitment. It creates resentment. And, you know, if you feel like you're being intimidated or coerced to do certain things, you feel resentment. Maybe you don't feel quite as motivated. One of the problems with reciprocity is people kind of see the relationships 100% in terms of reciprocity. I'm not going to do that unless I get some kind of a reward. We see people who don't go the extra mile. So that's a downside of reciprocity. The one thing about reason is if you're doing something because you believe in it, if you let me influence you and you buy into what I really want you to do and you're really committed to it, what it does is it minimizes my need to monitor or your performance, etc. This is kind of a little bit what we talk about self-motivation. But for you to kind of buy into everything I really want to have happen, it really takes a meeting of the minds, a lot of discussion, a lot of willingness on my part to hear your ideas, etc. So, but three ways we generally influence people, and I think the book talks more about these: that intimidation, coercion, reciprocity, and reason. So, what are some other ways you can gain power in an organization? Your book talks about these as sources of power, and there are two basic sources of power in an organization. One is personal, and if you think about these for a minute, one is expertise. We tend to let people influence us who have expertise, knowledge, or experience. So if you're going to an expert and you'll tend to give them power over you or influence over you based on their expertise. This is the whole basis for consulting and consultancy. We pay consultants because of their expertise. Another issue is personal attraction. Or remember when you took the personality traits, agreeable people. We tend to let agreeable people have influence over us, people who were nice. We also tend to give power to people who work hard, who put a lot of effort out, time and commitment. We tend to allow people to have a voice in things. And then we tend to give people power who, through legitimacy, in other words, their behavior is in tune with the organizational values and what's going on in the organization. So think about these four things for yourself in terms of gaining your own personal power. And don't underestimate some of them, like effort or attraction or gaining an expertise in a certain thing. So these are ways that you can gain personal power. There are also, but here's a little paradox before I go to the others, is successful organizations have members who are capable of gaining power by fitting in. Remember the legitimacy I mentioned? But then using that power to challenge the prevailing belief system that was responsible for them gaining power. In other words, this is part of the paradox I talk about with leadership and management skills, that your power and your legitimacy in terms of playing along and getting along maybe help you achieve more power. But at the same time, you're going to have to be willing to maybe break the system, to use that power to break it. So it's kind of a paradox. You want to keep things going, but at the same time, you have to make the needed change. Then, if you step up and you're in an organization, here's some things. Here are people who tend to have what I call some organizational sources of power. How central are you? Do you have access to information? If you work for Amazon, I would suspect that if your background is operations management, logistics, you're probably pretty central in the pecking order of what goes on there. How close are you to the action? In other words, if you work for HR in an investment bank, you're probably not too close. You're probably not too close to the central mission. What centrality has to deal with is how close are you to the key influencers in the organization? How central is your job to what's going on in your organization? If you're a marketing-oriented company, are you in marketing? I worked for an academic institution, and I was in one of the academic schools. So I was central to where power was, as opposed to, say, another department. How critical is the work you're doing to the overall mission? Another place to get power. So when you're thinking of maybe taking a job in an organization, these are some questions to ask yourself. How much flexibility do you have in your job? People with more flexibility tend to have a little more power. How visible are you? Are you seen by other influential people or people who advance your ideas? And the things that you're working on, how relevant are they to the organization? How aligned are they to the priorities of the organization? So these are all organizational ways that you can gain power and influence. So if you step back and think about gaining power in your organization, think about the personal dimensions you bring, but also think about these organizational dimensions. Also, if you want to help others gain power in an organization, these are things that you can support them in. So if someone asks you to volunteer to maybe help oversee the United Way campaign in your organization, it might not be a bad idea, because it's probably going to put you and make you visible to a lot of people in that organization, probably visible to people higher up in the organization. So look for ways to kind of get, if you're looking to gain influence and power. I like this quote from the textbook. Inexperienced, ineffective organizational members grumble about not having enough formal power to get work done, and they covet the influence wielded at higher levels. In contrast, savvy organizational members realize that informal network power is available to individuals at all levels. Furthermore, they understand that informal personal power generally precedes rather than follows from formal organizational power. There's a lot in that quote. And so what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about is politics and in relation of power to politics. Remember I mentioned that book, Reframing Organizations? And there it is again. By the way, the latest edition's really expensive. If you want to get this, I would go get a used copy of it. This book talks about 4 frames with which you could look at an organization. And I'm going to highlight one of the frames to talk a little bit about. Let me just quickly run through these for you to give you a sense. The political one that I want to talk a little bit about is the one associated with power in an organization. Like the structural frame, or that's things you typically you find in an organization: roles and relationships, the environment, culture. You have structures, you have rules and procedures, ways of doing things. You divide labor, you have specialization, you have management hierarchies, you have committees, you have all those things associated with the structure. And if from a structural point of view, if you're facing problems in your organization, it's because the structure doesn't fit, or you have a problem with structure. So if you're a structuralist, so to speak, you're always looking at how you can change the structure. So if there's a problem with structure, you reorganize. Another frame is the human frame, and here you focus on people. People have biases, they have needs, they have feelings, they bring expertise. You're really looking at putting the right people in the right spots and it's more important to have the people. You might even need to change the structure in order to keep some of the people. You find the effective organization will enable people to get the job done while feeling good about what they're doing. You're trying to enhance the people. If in this frame, if there's a problem, it's because human needs are frustrated. So you have to pay attention to what's going on to the human dimension. So if you're from this humanistic frame, you're going to tend to put emphasis on what you can do to develop people, change people, rather than necessarily on restructuring. Another frame that's not talked about is the symbolic frame. It's kind of the opposite of the structural. You talk about the culture and the values are real important. Logos and company symbols and all of those things are critical. The rituals, the stories, the myths. It's the question people ask is, when you interview someone, are they going to fit in here? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the symbolic frame. So, and this would say that leaders have a symbolic role to play. And it's all about managing the rituals, the stories, the symbols. In this frame, organization is like drama. And a lot of times, if we have problems in this frame, symbols lose their meaning, rituals lose their power. I wish I had more time to go into this. This is a pretty important framework for looking at organizations. And then finally is the political frame. And that's why I wanted to highlight this tonight, that basically organizations are arenas of scarce resources. And within that structure, power and influence are the determinants of the allocation of resources. So if you and I are all working in the same organization, we, by the very nature of being in the organization, are going to be in conflict with each other over resources. So the more influence I have, the more my people are going to have. And this is where power comes into play and conflict. Conflict is expected. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about conflict. Bargaining, coercion, compromise are all part of organization life. I have to try and influence others, maybe through reciprocity or reason or coercion, you name it. So what's the distribution of power, or is there a power vacuum? Political skill and acumen are important. So this is, when I talk about good politics, I'm talking about how do you use your power to influence things. That's what politics is. Here's some important assumptions when we talk about politics. We're dealing with allocation of resources. In many ways, organizations are just coalitions of interest groups. You have the marketing interest group, the finance interest group, the human relations, human resources interest group. So there's all these interest groups that are always competing for resources. Each different group has different values. Organizational goals arise out of bargaining and negotiation, vying for position. All these things come into play in an organization. So usually when we throw our nose up at politics, we're thinking of all the butt kicking and stuff like that that might go on in an organization that we associate with politics. But there is such a good thing as good politics. And I would maintain that you need to be a good politician to be a skilled leader. So power and conflict are central. Power is central features of being a good politician. The political believe that managers and leaders live in a world of competing interests and resources. The central task of leader is to mobilize the resources needed to advocate and fight for the unit's goals and objectives. Political leaders emphasize the importance of building power bases, allies, networks, coalitions. A good leader is an advocate and negotiator who understands politics and is comfortable with conflict. I'm going to give you these slides. You can read about the others. So I'm going to title you as the leader as politician. What do you need? Well, here's the reason politics exists. Difference, scarce resources, interdependence. And how do you confront all of these things and still channel human action in cooperative and sociably valuable directions? Again, the question I pose to you on power: how do you be a good politician without abusing or abusing your power? So here are some of the skills. You want to be able to create a vision, give people a sense of where you're headed. What's the main goal here? What is that main goal or objective? Being able to build networks is critical. Coalition building. A lot of times when we think of influencing people, we're thinking of just influencing people that work for us. You need to think about your ability to influence your peers, your boss, your boss's boss. So it means that you're going to need to have access to a lot of relationships. Networking, and which I'm a big believer in, networking is a skill, I think a leadership skill. Being able to get people to buy into your idea, building coalitions. The more you can network and build coalitions, the more you can break down the resistance to your ideas, etc. And then bargaining and negotiating. And we'll talk about that when we talk a little bit more about conflict. But being able to negotiate and bargain is a critical leadership skill related to power. So think of yourself, and when we talk about power as a leader, think of yourself as a politician in the good sense. So an effective political leader is an advocate, and an ineffective one is a con artist or hustler. So if you do it badly, people might see you as a con artist or a hustler. If you're doing it well, people will see you as an advocate. So there's that reframing organizations. And then just to wrap up a little bit, think about your own sources of power, where you get it. How do you gain power? And some of the things I talked about there. Think about the rule of reciprocity. And then how do you use that to influence others? How do you select proper strategies to influence others? And then how do you deal with inappropriate people who are inappropriately trying to influence you? So these are the kind of things to think about when we think about power. Some of the videos I have you looking at. The one video talks a little bit about people in different power levels in society. The other I am asking you to think about is Adam Grant's Adam Grant's Givers and Takers book, and he's the TED Talk I think you're going to watch. He's down at the University of Pennsylvania. And it basically asks the question, do nice guys finish last in an organization? So that's my thoughts for tonight on this. I just really wanted to highlight some key things from the chapter and, in my sense, how this notion of power fits in. When we talk a little bit about motivation, we'll be talking a little bit about the notion of empowerment, which has the word power in. So it really focuses on, do you feel powerful? So that's my thoughts. Anyone have any questions or anything you'd want to share? Good to see everyone. All right. Feel free to send me any questions, or anyone have any questions about the course before we hang up?
This is Ajit. Quick,
Sure.
not a question really, but kind of a guidance for this week assignment. So any tips or anything? I know those assignments has all instructions and all that stuff, but sometimes it's overwhelming, right? That hey, from where to start? What are my assets? And because of political landscape as well as the organizational uniqueness, it's always challenging, right? So at least for me, it's from where to start on those.
Oh, well, kind of read up on some of the things here. Are you talking about assignments for this week?
Yes.
Well, the one big assignment at the end of this week is the skill analysis paper. That's the one really big one. And as I was saying before I got on, there are some sample papers up there you can look at. So I would take a look at a couple of those. And as I said, this is the kind of paper, if you don't exactly get it done by Sunday, please take the time to take a few more days and get it right. This is the kind of paper that I would say you might want to hold on to and read in 5 years or 10 years. So take a look at some of the sample papers, see how people have done that. In terms of the power assignment, just kind of go down, kind of work down through the module one step at a time. I'll put this videotape up there tomorrow, kind of look at the overview and then look at the lecture stuff and then just move on right in sequence in the module.
Okay.
Anything else?
Thank you.
All right.